Greetings and welcome to this episode of Rail Riding Time. The train of time has arrived at its destination, so let's step out the carriage, make sure we mind the gap and make sure we close the doors afterwards. Today the train of time has brought us to Rye in East Sussex on the south coast of England. It is the 1890s in Britain and the railways are spreading across the country. Most towns by this time have got some sort of railway connection nearby. There are many reasons for the spread of the railways across Britain. Mostly, these reasons are the Industrial Revolution, making sure we can get the goods and raw materials exactly where they need to be. This is not so much the case in the southeast of England. Industry is not as big here as it is in other places in Britain. But a new industry is opening up. Thanks to changes in working conditions, people now have more time, free time, weekends, bank holidays in which to go out and explore and take up pastimes. Sport was becoming big during this time. Football was starting to take off and other sports including golf were starting to take off. This is the reason for building the Rye and Camber tramway. However, for Camber, even though the South Eastern and Chatham Railway had arrived in Rye in the mid-1850s, they still weren't getting the sort of visitors that they really wanted. This is because in that area, to get from Rye down to Camber, there was a couple of toll roads which had to go down, either that or they had to get on a ferry crossing and then walk there. This wasn't going to be good if they wanted to get more visitors to come down there. What they also needed was a reason for the visitors to come down there. Yes, the beach is all very good, however they need something else, a draw, a pull to bring them to them. It was decided that they'd try and build a golf course. Golf was taking off at this time all over the country. So they checked the area out and they found that around the area of Camber Castle was perfect to build a golf course. This was started and constructed in 1894. However, to get them to the golf course, as I stated before, wasn't the best route. What they needed was a better way for them to come down. When they left the train at Camber, walking down the toll roads to get to the golf course, it was generally they got so muddy upon their stockings and their boots that it was said that they could fill a couple of decent sized plant pots with the mud that was scraped off the boots. So a man called J.S. Vidler, who was prominent in making the golf course in the first place, was a driving force behind the making and creating of a railway from Rye to Camber to allow people to get to the golf course clean and to carry their stuff. It's unknown if he actually came up with the idea of railway, but we do know he was a big driving force behind it. On the 6th of April 1895, with a working capital of £2,300, the Rye and Camber Tramway Company was born. I've been keep calling it a railway. However, as I've just said in the title, it was actually known as a tramway. There's a big reason for this. Building railways is technical. It requires acts of parliament in order to secure land, and the building regulations are much higher to allow for much faster trains to run across them and much heavier trains to run along them. This wasn't necessary for the Rye and Camber, so they decided to be designated a tramway. This would mean there'd be fewer rules and regulations for them to follow, meaning they could get the maximum out of the £2,300 they had. Remember, that wasn't just for laying the tracks. They had to get the rolling stock, they had to get the loco, they had to build the buildings. Everything had to come out of that £2,300. And becoming a tramway allowed them to do this. The man picked to build the railway for the Rye and Camber tramway was a man called Holman F. Stevens. We'll hear more about him as we come to other light railways that the train of time will take us to. But this time it was one of his first railways he was built, and he was a young man just starting the business and had big ideas. In his letter to the Board of Trade, talking of the Rye and Camber tramway, he mentioned how he wanted to use an oil-fuelled engine mounted on a railway carriage bogie. If this had come out, this would have meant the Rye and Camber Railway would have been the first tramway or railway in Britain to use diesel as its power motive. Unfortunately, as was just said before, they didn't really have the money for this, so this was mooted and they went with steam instead, so they missed out on this accolade. However, Holman Stevens, or Holly as his friends would call him, pushed on and completed the building of the Rye and Camber tramway, and it was completed in mid-July 1895. It was 1 3/4 miles long and built in a 3-foot gauge. When it was complete, as was usual with any railway or tramway, the great and the good were invited to come down for a slap-up meal and have a ride on the railway or tramway for the first time. This happened on the 13th of July 1895. The day was a great success, and Camber, the little 240 tank that they'd bought for this, chugged along all day backwards and forwards, hauling the 2 wagons and single coach that was bought. This was the entire train and rolling stock for the Rye and Camber tramway at the time. The early success of the railway paid off, and after the first year they were able to pay a dividend of 7.5%. This also allowed them to buy another little tank that they called Victoria, and another carriage to go with it. 1901 saw the authorisation of a light railway in the area. The East Sussex Light Railway would run from the Rother Valley Railway down to the South Eastern and Chatham Railway at Ryde. It would also give them the right to run on and maintain the tracks of the Rye and Camber tramway. This would have been really helpful for the Rye and Camber at the time because they weren't doing very well. After their initial success, running trains during the winter time when all the passengers only came in summertime due to day tripping and using the golf course, it meant they were making a big loss during the winter time. There was consideration given to cut the services over winter. This would allow them to keep going as a viable railway. But this wasn't possible for the town of Rye, whose fishermen used the Rye and Camber tramway in order to get to their boats each day. So both the town council and the golf course agreed to subsidise the Rye and Camber tramway over the winter months to allow them to keep running. With this subsidy to help them along, this allowed the Rye and Camber tramway to keep going, and by 1906 they managed to come up with another good year and managed to pay a dividend of 4%. With this extra money they decided to invest it, and they built an extension of the tramway all the way down to the beach at Camber Sands itself, allowing day trippers to come from, say, London all the way down to Rye, short walk onto the tramway and get to the beach. This station was opened in 1908 and was named Camber Sands Station. In order to make sure that they could keep running as a viable tramway, it was decided that Camber Sands Station would close during the winter months. During these months the last terminus will be golf links, but there would be the occasional run down with the wagons in order to pick up sands from the Camber Sands to bring back to Rye and sell to the local builders. With this system in place, it was decided that subsidies would still need to be given to the tramway, both from the golf course and from the Rye Council itself. However, after the First World War, just like many railways in the country, they started to suffer with the competition of motor transport, and eventually in 1925 it was decided that it wasn't worth providing the subsidies anymore, and that the Rye and Camber tramway would have to go on its own. This lack of subsidy would mean they'd have to trim their running costs, and in 1925, just after the subsidies had stopped, Holman F. Stevens, the bloke who had built the railway in the first place, he'd also had a hand in running it over the years, finally got what he wanted right at the beginning. They purchased an old petrol-driven locomotive, probably originating from the trenches of the First World War, but they bought it from a local buildings merchant. So finally the Rye and Camber tramway had its petrol-driven locomotive. When it first came, people just thought it was an overgrown lawnmower, but it proved its worth. So much so that they were able to sell Victoria for scrap, and Camber spent most of its time sat in the shed, only to come out when absolutely necessary. This petrol-driven locomotive allowed the tramway to continue for about another 14 years before they finally succumbed to the pressures from the road transport industry. And in 1939 it was decided to stop running on the Rye and Camber tramway. However, this wasn't the end for the Rye and Camber tramway. Just like many places during the war, along the south coast the Admiralty built bases in various places in order to establish footholds or use them for various tasks during the war. The Admiralty used the line to move stock down to the jetty built on the River Rother, even extending the line down there to allow the trains to go right up to the boats for loading. This became particularly useful in the build-up to the D-Day invasion. If the D-Day landings were successful, one of the problems they would have is to make sure that all the vehicles were kept well supplied and the troops kept going. In order to keep the vehicles efficiently supplied with fuel over in Normandy, they built something called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. This would directly feed fuel from England under the Channel and straight into Normandy. After the war, the Admiralty handed back the Rye and Camber tramway to the owners to allow them to do what they wished. There were thoughts of reopening it and seeing if they could bring it back up to running status. However, like most of the railways during the war, they were in a very bad state when they were handed back over by the government. So, by September 1947, the Rye and Camber had closed down for the final time. Being a light railway, there isn't a lot left of the Rye and Camber tramway these days, but the evidence is still there. It kept going when everyone thought it was about to go. Through subsidies, through innovation, and in the war it became useful. But now, even today, there is still evidence left of the Rye and Camber out there. The bridge that went over the Broadwater River, although the rails are gone, the girders the rail sat on now carry a pipeline over the river. And as you walk down the fields that are still there, you can still see evidence of sleepers and rails. Thank you for joining me on this Rail Ride in Time, where we looked at the Rye and Camber Railway. It was a small railway, only 1.75 miles long. It was narrow. It had its problems all the way through. But even when they thought it finished, when they thought they could do no more, it managed to still be there to aid one of the biggest victories needed during the Second World War. There are many railways out there, some much greater, some much smaller, but all hold great significance in our land and the shaping of our country. If you enjoyed this Rail Ride in Time, please like and subscribe to the videos and find out where the train of time will take us next time. Until then, remember, always follow the tracks of curiosity and see where they lead you. Until the next Rail Ride in Time, farewell.